I want to talk to you this morning about refusing to bow. I want to first of all put to rest the fact that the rumor that on Saturday night I lay out all my clothes for Sunday morning. I just want all of you to know that that doesn't happen. But I want you to also know that when I was back in school on the first day, before the first day of the school, the night before, I would always lay out my clothes the night before on that first day of school. I did that all the way to my senior year. And I can remember my senior year, I can remember those pair of bell-bottom pants and that slick shirt and those high-heel shoes. Man, I was looking good on that first day of school. And I can remember getting those things out and preparing those things because the first day was always the best day because it was a start for something new. And I can remember new teachers. I can remember making new friends. I can remember new pens. I can remember new pencils. And I can remember a new tablet. Not the kind of tablet you use now. A different kind of tablet. I can remember all of those things and having those kinds of things because the new school year was special. I went to public schools during my time. I went to some private schools during my time. But I know that some of those years, all of those years, I was faced with difficulty. Because I was learning to be convicted about what it was that I ought to do. And I didn't always do that well. And as I look back on my life, there are times when I wish I would have made better decisions and more timely decisions. And I want to suggest something to you this morning as we begin, that regardless of where you attend school, maybe that you're in public education. You go attend a public school or a private school, or maybe you're in virtual school, or maybe you homeschool. Whatever the case may be with you, whatever decision that you and your parents have made about that, I'm going to suggest to you this morning that there are going to be some decisions that are going to be hard for you. And one of the hardest challenges you'll have as a believer is to live right among people who won't. That's about as succinctly as I know how to say it. You're going to be around some folks that just have no willingness to do what is right. And they're going to do things that are going to be difficult for you to do, and they should be difficult. Matter of fact, you can be a great help to those kind of people. But that's going to be hard for you to do. Let's just say it like it is. It's going to be hard. And it's going to be hard in part because those folks who do those kinds of things are basically recruiting you to be their friend because they need some validation. They need somebody to say to them, this is what I'm going to do, and if you'll do that with me, that will help me do that. That will validate what it is that I'm going to do. And so they're looking for that. And so I'm going to suggest something. You're going to have to know who you are. And as we sometimes say, you're going to have to be comfortable in your own skin. You're going to have to know what it is that you believe, and you're going to have to then make the decision based upon that. If you're going to do what's right. Now, if you don't care, then this lesson's going to be irrelevant to you, really. But if you care about doing what's right, and if you care at all about your relationship with God, then what I have to say to you this morning is going to be very challenging to you. Not just those of you who are young, but it's going to be challenging to all of us because all of us go through these difficulties. You're familiar with the story that's found in Daniel 1. It is a story about Hebrew boys being taken back to the land of Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans. And these boys they're the best of the best. The text tells us they're good looking, they're gifted in all wisdom, they possess knowledge, they're quick to understand, their aptitude is great, they have ability to serve in the king's palace, and that they're educated for 3 years. Some translations say they're trained for 3 years. And they're taught everything that a good Babylonian ought to be taught in terms of the literature and the language. And what happens here is that while they're taught these things, there is another familiar story that takes place, and it is found in chapter 3. These boys' names, first of all, are Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are those Hebrew names, but their names were changed to these Babylonian names, as we're mostly familiar with. And so when you think about the last three boys who are mentioned here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego particularly, we are familiar with the story that an image was built. King Nebuchadnezzar built an image, and he demanded that those who, when they heard the music play, that they would bow down. He built this 9-story image that very probably looked like him. And so in order to help consolidate his empire and to allow for personal loyalty to the king, the demand was made that when you hear the orchestra play, in essence, when you hear the symphony play, you need to bow down. And when we get to chapter 3, this is the passage that Barrett read for us a little earlier as we began our worship period. Daniel 3, then a herald cried aloud, to you it's commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So that at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. As I said, this was a sign of loyalty. And as you know, disloyalty was met to a trip to the fiery furnace. And for these three boys, this was a problem. This was a problem, and we're not told exactly why it was a problem, but we know it was a problem, very probably because they couldn't bow down. The first two commandments in their law, the law that they had allegiance to was, remember what they were? Have no other gods before me, God would say. And second of all, make no graven image. So the very two things created, these very two first commandments created a problem for these boys. They had two options. Bow or burn. That was it. Bow or burn. And they were like some of you. They were young. They were away from home. And they had the majority of their lives before them. And no doubt when they thought about their lives and their circumstances, most of their life had not been formed yet. But they had not lived most of their life. So they had that to look forward to. They didn't have parents, no priest, no counselor, no phone. They just had themselves and their thoughts. And they had decisions that they had to make. Well, you know what happened. In Daniel 3, beginning in verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods at worship, or worship the gold image which I've set up? Now, if you're ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made good. But if you do not worship, you'll be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who would deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They didn't bow. Pure and simple. They didn't bow. And verse 19 tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar was angry. He was full of fury. He was so mad that the expression on his face changed. Can't you imagine a conversation? Before possibly he goes into this fit, can't you imagine a conversation? Here's how it would go. Listen, guys, we've now known each other for some time, and I've done all these things for you that I'm not doing for anybody else. I'm just doing all these things for a select few. You have been put in a situation where you're going to expand and you're going to be made to be better than anybody else who's in this territory. And this is what you give me? This is what you do? And I love verse 16 when the boy said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to even answer you in this matter." And the gist of it was, we're good either way. God delivers us, He delivers us. If He doesn't, He doesn't. We're not bowing, furnace or not. Doesn't matter whether you heat it up 7 times hotter than it normally is, it's not going to matter. Now, I'm going to tell you, if all of us would just stop and think about that, it'll kind of be like what Tyler talked about this morning, about what Jesus went through. And basically, part of what I heard Tyler say, and I agree with him 100%, is I'm not sure any of us would have done what Jesus did. Now, maybe, hopefully, but I'm not sure any of us would have done what these boys did. Well, hopefully, maybe. We're talking about something that really none of us would ever have to face, I don't think. And of course, the rest of the story is that God rescued them. And the king really praised their God, the real God. And as a matter of fact, the text tells us that he promoted these boys in the kingdom. So the outcome was especially good for them. They were promoted. But let me say this, their pressure was life and death. None of us have gone through. I don't think any of us. I've never come close to that in my life. And my guess is none of you have ever come close. So when we read this story and when we talk about this story that we've talked about a long time, that we've heard about in all of our Bible classes, we teach this story to the youngest and we teach it all the way up to the oldest, and sometimes I think it loses its import to us because we've heard it so long. But don't lose sight of the fact that it was life or death with them. And I want you to notice this morning how they handled that. And I want to make 3 points that I think are really important. And I don't want you in this audience, if you're sitting here this morning and you're 50 or 60 or 70 years old, to say, "Man, this is a great lesson for young people to hear." Yes, but I'm going to tell you something. This is a good lesson for every single one of us to hear. Because there's all sorts of applications with these 3 boys that I want us to think about this morning. I want you to see what they did. And I want us to benefit from it. Well, number 1, I'm going to suggest that they learned conviction. I don't know if there's a lot of conviction much anymore. I don't know how many Christians are out there saying, "This is what I believe. And because this is what I believe, this is what I'm going to do." And that's the way that is. I don't know how many of us have that kind of conviction anymore. Now, that's not an indictment. Please don't misunderstand, because I think there are some who do. But I'm not sure the level of conviction. There was another Hebrew boy who was taken at this same time named Daniel. And in chapter 1 and verse 8, the passage tells us Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. This is what Daniel did. Daniel made that trip. And I don't know, the language would identify to me that Daniel had already decided. Another translation, which I like even better, it says he made up his mind. He made up his mind that he would not defile himself. So even before he got there, and certainly when it was offered to him, he had already decided, that's not what I'm going to do. I have some conviction about that. He could not partake of the king's delicacies as were going to be given to him. He couldn't do that. And evidently, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego followed. Evidently. But he made up his mind. They made up their minds to do what they did. They had some conviction. Or this passage in Hebrews 11 about Moses. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming, or that's the idea of considering, the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. And by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. All those are action. Almost every verb in those verses are action verbs. He refused, he chose, he esteemed, he endured. Those are all choices that he made. Okay. Now I want to make some applications. I want to make some applications that some of you either are facing or you've already faced or you will face. Some of you are part of groups. All of us, to some degree or another, are part of groups. You may be in a band. You may be on a team. You may be in a fraternity. You may be in a sorority. You may be part of something that makes some demands of you. And I'm going to tell you something. Now I want you to listen carefully. There are going to be things in those groups that are going to be very challenging for you. And it may not be that being in a particular group is inherently wrong. That's a choice that you have to make. But if you're in a group like that, or if you're in some other group, because all of us fall into the category. It can be a work group. At work, it can be another group at school, it can be a variety of things. But if you're in one of those groups, any group like that, here's what I'm here to tell you today. You better decide. You better decide what you're going to do. And you better make that decision based upon the fact that you have some conviction about what it is that you believe. Because I'm going to tell you something, folks. Some of you have succeeded in that, and some of you haven't. Now, you don't have to be in college. You can be in high school. You can be in middle school. You can be a young adult. You can be a middle-aged. You can be older. And all of us have failed in some capacity, in some way or another, with those very kinds of things. But I want to tell you something. We better think about what we do. We need to reevaluate the conviction that we have. And as I said, there may be nothing inherently wrong in what we're involved in. But I'm here to tell you, and you better be ready, when what happens in those groups goes against what you know to be a conviction that God has given you, you better be ready to say, I am not doing that. That's about the best way I know to say it. If you allow circumstances to change your choices, here's what I'm going to say about you. You don't have any conviction. If you allow the circumstances to change and to decide how you choose, you don't have any conviction. You don't have what these boys have. You may think you do, but you don't. And nor do I. If I allow circumstances to change what it is that I'm doing. And everybody here knows what choices I'm talking about. There's nothing here that's ambiguous, folks. Is there? Is there anything here that anybody's going, well, Kenny, what are you talking about? We all know what we're talking about. We know the kinds of things we're talking about here. And while there is nothing, as I said, there may be nothing wrong inherently with these choices and these groups and these opportunities that we all have, we better decide whose we are. These are things we don't particularly want to hear about. This is the kind of lesson nobody wants to hear. Because what it does, it forces me to think about what I do. And for a lot of us, what it does is it forces us to realize we fail. And so the question then becomes, well, what are we going to do about it? I want to ask you a question. Have you decided what your convictions are? You made up your mind what you're going to do? Or are you just going to wait till the circumstance rears its head, and then you're going to make a decision. Because I'm going to tell you what, if that's what you're waiting on, it's not going to be good. And they made choices. These boys made choices. And I'm going to suggest that their belief, not their feelings, shaped their choices. Because if they had made a choice based upon how they felt about it, had it been me, and I believe had it been them, they would have bowed down. If it was all about how they felt. But they made choices not on what they felt, they made choices on what they believed. And you'll make choices every day from a moral and an ethical standpoint. And if you make them on how you feel, you may or may not choose rightly. I can tell you that from biblical admonitions, and I can tell you about that from personal experience. And if you choose based on what's popular, that's not going to work most of the time. Not when it comes to what's moral and what's ethical. That's not going to work most of the time. If you just decide, well, what are most people doing? That's not going to work for you. And the idea of, well, the majority rules doesn't apply with morals and ethics. It's not what the majority does. It's not it at all. And may I say, please excuse your choice based upon a circumstance, or don't excuse your choice based upon the fact that you make somewhat of a fake choice. You have to make sure that why you do what you do is because you are convicted and you're willing to stand up and be counted. You ever thought about this? That first time that music started and those boys are standing there around that statue, don't you think that would have been a good time to look down and go, you know, my shoe's untied. I think I'm just going to reach down and tie my shoe. Well, that's hard. I can't get it for some reason. I better stay down until the music stops. Now, we may laugh at that. We may think, well, that's ridiculous. I don't know that it is. I've made excuses before. I've made several excuses before that helped me fit. My guess is these boys stayed upright, they stood upright, and they stayed. And from what I can tell, they may have even done it with their chest sticking out a little bit. But they weren't shying away from the choice that they made because they had these convictions already. And then finally, let me suggest this. They weighed consequences. Their choices came with the idea of reward or consequences. And this wasn't some small deal here, folks. This was, am I going to live or am I going to die? That's what this was. Either God, capital G, or God, little g. Am I going to honor the true God, or am I going to just honor myself, which is basically little g? I'll do what I want to do. And, a lot of us, whether we're in school or whether we're in our workplace, no matter, here's the issue. Here's the moral issue. We have a decision to make. Are we going to lie? Are we going to cheat? Are we going to steal? Are we going to engage in immoral behavior because that's what I want? Or am I going to compromise? Or am I going to fake it? Am I going to do something just because I want this to look like what I want it to look like? Are we going to stand up and say, I'm a Christian? This is what Christians do. I don't do that because I'm trying to throw it in somebody's face, or because I'm trying to stand up and say, look at me, or I'm trying to be self-right. I'm not doing it for all those kind of reasons. I'm just doing it because that's what God wants me to do. See, this is not hard. Have I missed this? Or is this story not in Daniel 3 for this very reason we're talking about today? Isn't this what this story is saying? I don't know of a story that's more clearly saying what we're trying to say about it in the Bible than this story. Sometimes when you're asked to do things that you know you ought not do, then have some conviction and don't do those things. Is that not what this story's saying? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reaped a reward. Daniel, I think, reaped a reward. Let me make a final point, one final thought. You know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't the only boys taken. You ever thought about that? We talk about them all the time when we raise them up, and we should. I wonder what those other fellas thought. Who were their friends who came with them from back home? I wonder what they thought when they saw these boys stand up and not bow. What we're talking about here, folks, is hard. There are those of you here this morning who are disciples of Jesus Christ, and a lot of you run together in the same circles. And sometimes there's pressure on you because you run in those same circles with some of the same people you're sitting by this morning, or you see here in this auditorium this morning. You run in the same circles. And sometimes because one makes a decision, all make a decision. And that's the wrong way to do it. It's not a group effort. It's not a group decision. It's what am I going to do? One thing that I'm reminded of when the spies, remember when the spies were sent out, those 12 spies were sent out? Do you know who those 12 spies were? Those 12 spies were the leaders among those tribes. Every one of them. Every single one of them was a leader in those tribes. 12 of them went out and only 2 came back and said, we can take it. But all of them were leaders. All of them were believers. All of them were some of the best Jewish boys, but only 2 came back and said, we can take the land. You know what? You know, it took a lot for Caleb and Joshua to say, hey, come on, guys. We can do this. So this kind of stuff we're talking about this morning, it's hard to do. Again, I know because the Bible tells me so. I see examples where I know it's hard, and I know from personal experience it's hard. So here's the questions that I want to ask you. Do you have conviction? What are you going to choose? And are you willing to evaluate the consequences? Are you willing to live with that? See, this is not hard to preach. It's hard to live. It's real hard to live. Because I know how hard it is to stand up by yourself. But if you're going to be what God wants you to be, my young friends, you got to do that. And my old friends, you got to do that. My contemporaries, we have to do that. I think this is an important lesson. And I pray that none of us will bow down. So, make that decision. Reach those conclusions. Have that conviction. Decide this is what I'm going to do. I'm never going to give in. I'm never going to compromise. I'm never going to do what God doesn't want me to do. I'm always going to make that right decision, and you'll always be proud of the fact that you've done that. That's what I had to say to you this morning. But it's hard. But the Lord never said it's going to be easy. Following Him is never easy. It may be this morning that there's somebody here who says, I need to follow the Lord, but Kenny, you don't understand how hard it is. I may not, but God does. I may not understand it. I may not understand what all you're going to have to give up, and what all you're going to have to do in the relationships it could be. I may not understand any of that. But He demands of you, if you want to follow Him, you're going to have to do hard things. So you have to decide. And if we can help you with that this morning, that's exactly what we'd like to do. Brian's going to lead us in a song. And if you have a spiritual need that we can help you with, come as we stand and as we sing.